Hey guys, close your eyes and picture the Egypt from the postcards. The shimmering gold of Tutankhamun, the majestic silhouettes of the Giza Plateau, and the serene lap of the Nile against fertile banks. It looks like a dream, doesn't it? A mystical oasis of wisdom and wonder. But if you actually stepped out of a time machine and onto that sand, that dream would turn into a dehydration-fueled nightmare faster than you can say mummification. Today, we're stripping away the Hollywood glitter to ask the real question. Why wouldn't you last even 24 hours in the land of the Pharaohs? Trust me, the local wildlife is the least of your worries when the very air you breathe is trying to slow cook you. Now, before we dive into the dust, if you're a fan of exploring the grittier side of history, consider hitting that subscribe button, but only if you're ready to see the past without the filter. And drop a comment below letting me know. If you had to be stuck in any ancient civilization, which one would you choose? I'd love to see your pics. For now, find a cool spot. Maybe grab a glass of water. You're going to need it. And let's begin. You don't wake up in ancient Egypt. You are conscripted into consciousness. There is no gentle transition from the dream state to the waking world. Instead, your internal clock is overridden by the brutal efficiency of the Egyptian sun, Ra, who doesn't care if you stayed up late watching the moonlight hit the Nile. By 5:30 a.m., the sun isn't just a light source, it's a physical weight. Imagine waking up inside a pizza oven that's just been switched to preheat. Your home is a mud brick house, a marvel of ancient engineering made from Nile silt and straw, designed to keep the heat out during the day. The problem? It also works in reverse. All that thermal mass absorbed the desert's 110-degree fury for 12 hours yesterday, and now it's radiating that heat directly into your kidneys through the floor. The air is thick, dry, and smells faintly of stagnant river water and the communal cooking fires of your neighbours. There are no windows in the modern sense, just small, rectangular slits high up on the walls, designed to let out the heat without letting in the blinding glare of the Sahara. Before you even open your eyes, you hear it, the hum. In the modern world, flies are an annoyance. In ancient Egypt, they are an inescapable constituent of the population. They are everywhere. They are on your lips. They are exploring your nostrils, and they are clustered in the corners of your eyes, seeking out the only moisture available in a land defined by its absence. In a world without mesh screens or bug spray, you learn to live in a state of constant low-level combat. You swat them away, but it's a futile gesture, like trying to push back the tide. They are the true masters of the Egyptian morning, and they ensure that sleeping in is a luxury that simply does not exist for the living. As you try to shift your weight, your neck lets out a crack that sounds like a dry reed snapping. You reach back to massage the base of your skull and feel the cold, unforgiving surface of your wessel. To the modern eye, this looks like a piece of abstract sculpture, or perhaps a very uncomfortable footstool. To an Egyptian, it is a pillow. It is a curved wooden or alabaster headrest on a pedestal. Why? Because in this heat, laying your head on a fabric pillow would be like wrapping your brain in a wool sweater. The headrest allows for airflow around your neck, keeping you, theoretically, cooler. More importantly, if you're anyone of status, you've spent hours, or a small fortune, having your hair braided, beeswaxed and styled. You aren't about to ruin that investment by rubbing it against a linen sack filled with straw. You sleep with your neck perched on a wooden crescent, effectively balancing your head in the air like a bowl of fruit. One wrong turn in your sleep doesn't just wake you up. It leaves you with a cervical misalignment that would make a modern chiropractor weep. You kick off your blanket, which is really just a single, coarse sheet of linen. In the flickering dawn light, you can see the quality of your life woven into the fabric. If you're lucky, it's a fine, semi-transparent weave that feels like a light breeze. If you're a commoner, which, statistically, you are, it's a scratchy, grit-filled shroud that feels like 80 grit sandpaper. There is sand in the bed. There is sand in your hair. There is sand in the creases of your elbows. The Egyptian desert is not a polite neighbor. It is an intruder. It finds its way through the reed matting of your door and settles on everything you own. As you sit up, the linen clings to your sweat-damp skin, and you realize that moisture-wicking technology is a concept 3,000 years in the future. You are simply damp, dusty, and already exhausted. You stand up and walk toward the doorway, which is likely just a draped piece of heavy fabric or a screen of woven papyrus. There is no private space. Your house is built wall to wall with your neighbors to maximize the shade provided by the narrow, winding alleys. You can hear your neighbor coughing. You can hear a donkey braying 3 houses down. And you can hear the rhythmic thud-thud-thud of a woman nearby grinding grain into flour, the heartbeat of the city. In ancient Egypt, the concept of the individual is secondary to the household. You live in a hive. Your movements are tracked by the gods, the Pharaohs' tax collectors, and the lady next door who wants to know why you're still in bed when the sun has already cleared the horizon. You step outside onto the threshold. The light is already so intense that it feels like a physical slap across the face. This is the ultraviolet violence of the Nile Valley. The sky isn't blue. It's a searing, bleached white. You look toward the horizon where the Great Pyramids stand. Today, we see them as weathered, tan ruins. But for you, standing there in the dust, they are blinding. They are encased in polished Tura limestone, reflecting the sun back at the world like giant triangular mirrors. They don't look like tombs. They look like power plants, glowing with a divine radiation that reminds you every single morning that you are very small and the gods are very, very large. You haven't even had a sip of water yet, but you can already feel the moisture leaving your body. Your skin is tightening, your throat is scratchy, and the day has only just begun. Welcome to the office. It's 105 degrees. Your boss is a living god, and your only dental plan is a prayer to Anubis, the great river bathhouse. In the modern world, cleansing is a private, temperature-controlled ritual involving pressurized hot water and a strawberry-scented loofah. In ancient Egypt, hygiene is a public, high-stakes battle against the elements. After peeling yourself off your wooden headrest, your first destination isn't a tiled bathroom. It's the Nile. The Nile is the lifeblood of the empire, but it's also the communal bathtub, the laundromat, and the waste disposal system for millions of people and animals. Imagine walking down to the riverbank as the sun begins its ascent. You aren't looking for a refreshing dip. You're looking for a patch of water that isn't currently occupied by a drinking ox or a pile of upstream refuse. This is hygiene in its rawest form. There is no privacy, no temperature control, and certainly no no-slip mats. There's just the squelch of river mud between your toes and the constant nagging awareness that while you're looking for a wash, a crocodile might be looking for a snack. The soap, that isn't soap. Once you're in the water, don't expect a rich, bubbly lather. The concept of soap as we know it, fats reacted with alkali to create a foaming cleanser, is still a work in progress. Instead, you're reaching for a bowl of natron. Natron is a naturally occurring salt harvested from dry lake beds. To the Egyptians, it is the ultimate purifier. To your skin, it is a relentless abrasive. Rubbing natron on your body is essentially exfoliating with industrial-grade salt. It's effective at killing bacteria and absorbing oils, but it also stings like a swarm of hornets if you have so much as a paper cut. If you're feeling particularly fancy, you might mix it with animal fats or vegetable oils to create a cleansing cream, but the result is a greasy, salty film that you have to scrape off with a metal or stone tool called a strigil. You aren't so much washing as you are resurfacing your epidermis. To an ancient Egyptian, body hair isn't just a nuisance. It's a sign of being uncivilized, or worse, a playground for lice. In a land where the heat is constant, hair is a liability. Consequently, the Egyptian skincare routine involves a scorched earth policy toward every follicle below your eyebrows. If you're a priest, you might shave your entire body every 2 days. If you're a commoner, you're using flint razors or copper blades that are about as sharp as a butter knife. There is no shaving cream. There is no aftershave. You are dragging a piece of sharpened metal across dry, salt-scrubbed skin. The result is a perpetual state of razor burn that would make a modern human scream. For those who can't stand the blade, there's sugaring, a mixture of honey, oil, and bird bones used as a proto-wax. It's sticky, it's painful, and in 100-degree heat, it attracts every fly within a 5-mile radius. Once you've scraped yourself clean and hairless, it's time for the makeup. In the movies, the black eyeliner, kohl, is a fashion statement. In reality, it's a survival tool. You apply thick rings of galena, lead ore, and malachite, copper ore, around your eyes for 3 very practical, very gritty reasons. First, the dark pigment acts like an ancient version of a football player's eye black, cutting the blinding glare of the Sahara sun. Second, the lead salts in the kohl actually have antimicrobial properties. It's a primitive way to ward off the horrific eye infections caused by the Nile's dust and flies. Third, it's believed to ward off the evil eye. However, let's look at the grit. You are painting your face with heavy metals. Every day, you're absorbing trace amounts of lead and copper directly through your skin. While it saves you from a localized infection, it's doing a slow, silent number on your internal organs. But hey, at least you'll look divine in your sarcophagus. In a world of constant sweating and zero deodorants, how do you handle the smell? You don't use a spray, you use a scent cone. At banquets or high society gatherings, Egyptians would place a cone of scented fat, usually ox tallow mixed with myrrh and frankincense, on top of their heads or wigs. As the evening heat intensifies, the fat slowly melts. It trickles down your wig, over your face, and onto your linen clothes. To the Egyptians, this was the height of luxury, a walking, melting air freshener. To you, it would feel like someone poured lukewarm bacon grease over your head. By the end of the night, you aren't just scented, you are literally basting in the desert heat. The grease traps the dust. The salt from the natron reacts with the sweat. And the result is a tactile nightmare that no amount of Nile water can truly wash away. We can't talk about hygiene without talking about the mouth. There are no toothbrushes in Egypt, only chew sticks made from frayed twigs. But the real problem isn't the lack of a brush, it's the bread. Because the grain is ground on open-air stone slabs. The flour is perpetually contaminated with desert sand and tiny stone shards. Every meal is an abrasive event. By the time you're 30, your teeth aren't just yellowed. They're physically worn down to the nubs. The skincare for your mouth usually involves mouthwashes made of honey and herbs to mask the smell of decaying gums. If a tooth gets too bad, your only hygiene option is an extraction performed with a bronze probe and a prayer that the infection doesn't travel to your brain. Finally, there is the reality of the water you just bathed in. The Nile is home to schistosoma, a parasitic flatworm that lives in snails. Every time you step into the water to get clean, these microscopic larvae are boring through your skin and entering your bloodstream. They set up shop in your bladder or intestines, leading to a lifetime of chronic pain and Egyptian hematuria, blood in the urine. In ancient Egypt, this was so common that boys were often thought to have reached puberty when they started menstruating, bleeding from the parasite. Your hygiene routine, intended to make you pure for the gods, is actually the primary way the environment colonizes your body from the inside out. You finish your routine by looking at yourself in a polished copper mirror. You don't see a glowing, hydrated influencer. You see a person whose skin is tight and leathery from salt, whose eyes are ringed with heavy metals, and whose body is slick with melting animal fat. You are clean by the standards of the 18th dynasty, but your pores are screaming, your scalp is itching, and the sun hasn't even reached its zenith. You've survived the morning wash, but the real work and the real heat is just beginning. After the sensory assault of the morning sun and the abrasive reality of your skincare routine, your stomach begins to protest. In the modern world, breakfast is a choice between a protein shake, a caffeinated latte, or perhaps a bowl of sugary cereal. In ancient Egypt, breakfast isn't a choice, it's a biological necessity dictated by the sheer caloric demands of a world without machines. You are hungry, but you aren't looking for flavor profiles. You are looking for fuel. You head back to the shaded corner of your mud brick courtyard, where the household's communal supplies are kept. There is no refrigerator, no pantry sealed against pests. Instead, there are clay jars, woven baskets, and a fine layer of dust covering everything. Your breakfast of champions consists of two primary pillars that supported the entire civilization for 3 millennia: bread and beer. But don't let those words fool you. This isn't the sourdough or the craft IPA you know. This is survival in its most rugged, unrefined form. Let's start with the bread. To the Egyptians, bread was so central to life that the word for food and bread were often the same. But the process of making it is where the grit truly begins. The grain, usually emmer wheat or barley, is ground by hand by the women of the house. They use a saddle quern, a flat stone base where the grain is crushed with a smaller stone rolled back and forth. Because this happens in open-air courtyards or on the dirt floors of houses, the process is never clean. The wind blows the fine, razor-sharp silt of the Sahara into the flour. As the grinding stones wear down from hours of friction, tiny fragments of igneous rock and granite flake off into the dough. When you take your first bite of that heavy, dense loaf, you aren't just eating carbohydrates, you are eating the desert itself. The bread has a literal crunch that has nothing to do with a crispy crust. It is filled with inorganic grit that acts as an industrial abrasive on your teeth. By the time an Egyptian reached the age of 25, the cusps of their molars were often ground completely flat, exposing the sensitive pulp beneath. Chronic tooth abscesses were the participation trophy for surviving on an Egyptian diet. Every chew is a gamble, and every swallow is a reminder that the land is trying to consume you as much as you are consuming it. To wash down the sand-filled bread, you reach for a ceramic jar of beer. In ancient Egypt, beer was not a weekend treat. It was a dietary staple served to everyone from the pharaoh down to the pyramid laborers. It was even used as a form of currency. But if you're picturing a cold, carbonated beverage with a nice head of foam, you're in for a shock. Ancient Egyptian beer, or zythum, is thick. It's opaque, room temperature, and has the consistency of a thin porridge or a very chunky milkshake. It's made by lightly baking beer bread dough, breaking it into jars of water, and letting it ferment in the heat. There is no filtration system. When you take a sip, you are sucking in floating bits of grain, husks, and yeast. However, there's a grim reason this was the beverage of choice. It was often safer than the water. The fermentation process killed off many of the pathogens that turned the Nile into a biological minefield. You aren't drinking to get a buzz, though at 3 to 4% alcohol, that's a side effect. You're drinking because it's a source of vitamins and liquid calories that won't give you dysentery quite as fast as the river water would. If you're lucky, and I mean favoured by the gods lucky, your breakfast might include a few extras. Maybe a handful of green scallions, some dried leeks, or a couple of shriveled figs. Vegetables like lentils, chickpeas, and lettuce were the backbone of the commoner's diet, but they were almost always served raw or stewed in a clay pot until they lost all structural integrity. Meat. Forget about it. In ancient Egypt, cattle were far too valuable as work animals to be eaten for breakfast. Beef was a holy food reserved for temple sacrifices and the elite 1%. If you were a commoner, the only way you were getting animal protein was if you caught a fish in the Nile, risking the aforementioned crocodiles, or trapped a migratory bird with a clap net. Even then, the meat was often salted or dried until it had the texture of an old leather sandal to prevent it from rotting in the 110-degree heat. As you sit there chewing your sandy bread, you aren't alone. You are surrounded by a biological ecosystem that views your breakfast as a shared resource. We've mentioned the flies, but the real grit lies in the containers. Grain storage in ancient Egypt was a constant battle against weevils, beetles, and rodents. It was almost impossible to keep the grain pure. When you eat your porridge or bread, you are inevitably consuming a significant amount of bonus protein in the form of insect larvae and rodent droppings that were ground up along with the wheat. It's a reality that would trigger a modern health inspector into a coma, but for you, it's just Tuesday. Furthermore, the lack of refrigeration means that everything is in a state of controlled decay. The figs are fermenting on their own. The milk, if you can get it from a goat, is turning into yogurt within hours, and the fresh vegetables are wilting before the sun is even halfway up the sky. The grit of the Egyptian diet also highlights the brutal social hierarchy. While you're struggling with your grit-filled bread and chunky beer, the elite in the villas are eating honey-soaked cakes made from finely sifted flour, roasted waterfowl, and imported wine from the Delta. They still have the toothware issues. Sand is the great equalizer in Egypt, but their breakfast is a display of power. For the average person, breakfast is a functional, repetitive, and often painful chore. You eat quickly, not because the food is good, but because you need the energy for the 14-hour shift of manual labor that's about to begin. By the time you finish your meal, your mouth feels like you've been chewing on a beach. Your stomach is heavy with fermented grain, and you're already feeling the first signs of the Nile bloat. Because the diet is so high in fiber and unrefined grains, and so riddled with parasites from the water, chronic gastrointestinal distress is the baseline for human existence. You stand up, wipe the crumbs and fly-covered beer foam from your lips, and prepare to face the day. You've successfully fueled your body, but in doing so, you've introduced more sand, bacteria, and parasites into your system than most modern humans encounter in a year. The sun is now high, the shadows are shrinking, and the breakfast of champions is already burning off as you head toward the fields or the construction sites. You survived the meal, but the desert has already taken a small toll on your teeth and your gut. In our modern imagination, ancient Egypt is often viewed through the lens of the elite, priests chanting in cool stone temples, or royals lounging on cedar chairs. But if you were dropped into this world for a day, you wouldn't be the person holding the scepter. You'd be the person holding the rope. For 90% of the population, life was defined by the corvée system, a mandatory labor tax where you were summoned by the state to perform grueling physical work in exchange for your survival. By 8 a.m., the heat has transitioned from uncomfortable to hostile. You aren't clocking into an office with a water cooler. You are stepping into a landscape of dust, limestone, and relentless solar radiation. Whether you are a farmer in the black silt of the Delta or a laborer at a construction site in the Red Land, your 14-hour shift is about to begin. There is no weekend. There is only the rise and fall of the Nile, and the quotas that must be met. If you are a farmer, the backbone of the empire, your day is spent in a rhythmic, back-breaking dance with the river. Because the Nile's floodwaters eventually recede, you have to move water from the low-lying river up to your thirsty crops. To do this, you use a shaduf. The shaduf is a long pivoting pole with a bucket on one end and a heavy mud counterweight on the other. It looks simple, but try doing it 10,000 times a day. You pull the bucket down into the water, fighting the weight, and let the counterweight help you swing the water up into a higher irrigation trench. Your shoulders are screaming by noon. Your hands are a map of cracked skin and deep calluses. And you aren't just fighting gravity, you're fighting the parasites in the mud and the very real possibility of a cobra nesting in the reeds. If the water doesn't move, the crops die. If the crops die, you and your family are deleted from the census. Perhaps you've been drafted for a state project. Maybe it's a new temple for Ramses or a tomb for a high-ranking official. Forget the alien theories. The reality of Egyptian construction was far more impressive and infinitely more painful. It was powered by human hydraulics. You are part of a gang of laborers tasked with moving a multi-ton block of limestone. There are no pulleys. There are no wheels. Wheels were essentially useless in the deep sand. Instead, you were pulling on a massive hemp rope, your feet digging into the hot grit for traction. A liquidator stands at the front of the wooden sledge, pouring water onto the sand to make it slick. The grit here is literal. The fine limestone dust kicks up with every movement, coating your sweat-slicked lungs. Silicosis, a lung disease caused by inhaling stone dust, is the silent killer of the Egyptian workforce. You aren't just building a monument, you are breathing it in. Your spine is under constant compression, and by the age of 30, your vertebrae will likely show the same wear and tear as a modern person in their 80s. You might think, I'll just be a scribe. I'll sit in the shade and write on papyrus. While being a scribe was the white-collar dream of the ancient world, it came with its own brand of physical misery. To become a scribe, you spent your childhood being beaten into submission. An Egyptian proverb literally states, "A youngster's ear is on his back. He only listens when he is beaten." As an adult scribe, you sit cross-legged on the ground for 12 hours a day, hunched over a roll of papyrus. You are the human spreadsheet for the Pharaohs' grain silos. The constant crouching leads to permanent hip deformities and lower back collapse. Your eyes, strained by the flickering oil lamps and the tiny, intricate hieratic script, begin to fail you early. You may have escaped the sun, but you haven't escaped the physical toll of the Egyptian machine. There is no paycheck at the end of the week. Egypt is a barter economy. At the end of your shift, you are given your ration, a specific volume of grain and jars of that chunky, warm beer we discussed. This isn't just your dinner, it's your bank account. If the harvest was poor, or the local governor is corrupt, your rations might be delayed. This led to the first recorded labour strikes in history. In the village of Deir el-Medina, tomb builders literally walked off the job and staged a sit-in because their grain hadn't arrived. They weren't fighting for a 40-hour work week. They were fighting against starvation. When you finish your shift, you aren't going home to relax. You are hauling your heavy grain sacks back to your hut, praying that the weevils don't get to them before you can trade some of that barley for a new pair of reed sandals. The most exhausting part of the 14-hour shift isn't the physical weight of the stones. It's the lack of agency. In ancient Egypt, you are part of Mayat, the divine order of the universe. Your labour isn't seen as work in the modern sense. It is a religious obligation. To stop working is to disrupt the balance of the cosmos. This psychological pressure means there is no mental health day. You work through the heat exhaustion. You work through the sand-eye infections. You work through the grief of losing a child to the river. You are a single brick in a wall that is designed to last for eternity, and the wall doesn't care if the brick is tired. As the sun finally begins to dip toward the western horizon, the realm of the dead, the shift ends. You don't have the energy to decompress. You stumble back toward your village, your skin caked in a mixture of salt, sweat, mud, and stone dust. Your muscles are in a state of permanent lock, and your ears are ringing from the constant shouting of the overseers. You've survived the day's labour, but tomorrow the sun will rise again. The Nile will still need to be moved, and the Pharaoh will still need his monuments. You are trapped in a cycle of relentless ultraviolet violence and manual exertion that would break a modern athlete within a week. In the modern world, if you have a grievance with your employer, You might file a complaint with HR or vent about your boss on social media. In ancient Egypt, your boss isn't just a CEO. He is the living embodiment of Horus, the son of Osiris, and the physical link between the heavens and the earth. This isn't just a job title, it's a terrifying political and spiritual reality that dictates every breath you take. The pharaoh doesn't just rule the country, he owns it. Technically, every grain of sand, every drop of Nile water, and every drop of sweat you shed belongs to the throne. This creates a psychological environment of total, unquestioning submission. You don't disagree with the pharaoh's policies. To do so would be to disagree with the sunrise. In the Egyptian mind, the pharaoh's primary job is to maintain Ma'at, the divine balance of the universe. If the pharaoh fails, the sun doesn't rise, the Nile doesn't flood, and the world collapses into chaos. Living under a god-king sounds grand in a movie, but the day-to-day grit involves a massive, suffocating bureaucracy. Between you and the pharaoh is an endless ladder of viziers, nomarchs, regional governors, and tax collectors. These men are the eyes and ears of the king, and they are everywhere. Imagine you've had a particularly brutal harvest. The sun was too hot, the locusts were too hungry, and your grain jars are nearly empty. In a modern society, there might be a safety net. In Egypt, the tax collector arrives with a squad of soldiers carrying wooden staves. They don't care about your unfortunate circumstances. They have a quota to fill for the pharaoh's granaries. If you can't pay your grain tax, the consequences are visceral. You might be beaten, publicly, to serve as a warning to the rest of the village. There is no due process as we understand it. The law is whatever the local official says it is, backed by the absolute authority of a man who lives in a palace of gold. You are a small cog in a machine that values the monument over the man. In ancient Egypt, the concept of pulling yourself up by your bootstraps is virtually non-existent. Social mobility is a myth for 99% of the population. If your father was a farmer, you are a farmer. If your father was a stonecutter, you are a stonecutter. This isn't just about lack of opportunity, it's about the spiritual belief that your place in the social order was divinely ordained. To try and change your status is to rebel against the cosmic order. This creates a culture of profound stagnation. You spend your 14-hour shift looking at the same horizon, doing the same task your grandfather did, knowing your son will do the same thing. The grit here is the mental claustrophobia. There is no career path. There is only the repetition of duty until your body gives out. Offending the state wasn't just a legal slip-up, it was a spiritual death sentence. If you were accused of a crime, especially one involving the pharaoh's property or the temples, the punishments were designed to be as unpleasant as the desert heat. Mutilation was a common penalty. You might have your nose or ears cut off, marking you as a criminal for the rest of your short life. For more severe crimes, you might be sent to the gold mines of Kush. This wasn't just a prison, it was a death camp. Prisoners were worked in total darkness, in suffocating heat, with barely enough water to keep them conscious, until they collapsed. In the God King system, your body is a resource. Once you stop being a productive resource and become a problem, the state has no use for your preservation. Everywhere you look, you are reminded of your place. The massive temple walls aren't just art, they are state-sponsored propaganda. They show the pharaoh as a giant, 10 times larger than his enemies. crushing the skulls of foreigners or standing stoically before the gods. As you walk through the dusty streets of Thebes or Memphis, you are constantly dwarfed by these images. They serve as a psychological anchor, keeping the population in a state of perpetual awe and holy terror. You are taught that without the pharaoh, the monsters of the underworld would devour the world. You don't just follow him because you have to. You follow him because you are terrified of what happens if he's not there. The God-King problem boils down to a very lopsided deal. You provide the labor, the taxes, and the absolute devotion. In exchange, the pharaoh guarantees that the universe keeps functioning. But when things go wrong, when the Nile flood is too low and famine sets in, the blame never goes to the top. It goes to the people. It's because the people weren't pious enough, or they didn't work hard enough. The grit of Egyptian politics is the realization that you are entirely expendable. You are a nameless face in a crowd of thousands whose only purpose is to ensure that one man can live in luxury and eventually become a god in the afterlife. As the day winds down and you see the golden light hitting the top of the pharaoh's palace, you don't feel a sense of national pride. You feel the weight of the crown on your neck. You realize that your life is a series of "Yes, my lord," and "It shall be done." You have survived another day under the gaze of the God King, but at the cost of your individuality. You are a subject in the truest, most grueling sense of the word. You've avoided the tax collector's staff and the governor's wrath, but the psychological shadow of the throne follows you even into your sleep. In the 21st century, a scratch from a rusty nail or a persistent cough is a minor inconvenience. A trip to the pharmacy, a round of antibiotics, and you're back on your feet. In ancient Egypt, that same scratch is a potential death sentence. Here, the invisible killers aren't just bacteria and viruses. They are malevolent spirits, angry gods, and a medical system that is half genius and half hallucination. The grit of Egyptian medicine is the absolute lack of a safety net. If you fall ill, you aren't just fighting a pathogen. You are fighting a world where science hasn't yet been separated from sorcery. Your doctor, the SADUNW, is likely a priest first and a physician second. He approaches your body not as a biological machine, but as a vessel that has somehow offended the divine order. Let's look at your options when you get sick. The Ebers Papyrus, one of the most famous medical documents of the era, contains over 800 remedies. Some of them are surprisingly advanced, like using willow leaves, which contain salicylic acid, the basis for aspirin, to treat pain. But for every breakthrough, there are a dozen treatments that would make a modern stomach churn. If you have a wound that won't heal, the prescribed poultice might include honey, which is a natural antiseptic, mixed with crocodile dung, or perhaps a paste made of fly droppings and lizard blood. The logic was that foul substances would drive away the foul spirits causing the disease. In reality, you were often introducing a cocktail of bacteria directly into an open wound. You aren't just healing, you are playing a high-stakes game of infection roulette. We've discussed the Nile as a bathtub and a kitchen, but as a biological weapon, it is unmatched. The most persistent invisible killer in your life is schistosomiasis. This parasite, living in the snails that thrive in the river's irrigation channels, enters your body through your skin while you work or wash. Once inside, It wreaks havoc on your internal organs, specifically the bladder and liver. In ancient Egypt, hematuria, blood in the urine, was so universal that people didn't even consider it a disease. They considered it a normal part of growing up. Your body is perpetually hosting a colony of worms that are slowly scarring your insides. This leads to chronic anemia, lethargy, and a weakened immune system. You aren't lazy because the sun is hot. You're exhausted because your body is literally being eaten from the inside out by the river you worship. The Egyptians believed the body was a network of channels called metu, similar to the irrigation canals of the Nile. They believed that health was maintained by the flow of blood, air, and waste through these pipes. If a channel became blocked, rot would set in. The grit of this theory led to a bizarre obsession with laxatives. To prevent the rot from accumulating, Egyptians would often use aggressive enemas or emetics, substances to induce vomiting, 3 days a month. They were essentially performing a biological spring cleaning using castor oil and beer. While they were right that blockages are bad, their methods often led to severe dehydration, a lethal condition in a 110-degree desert. You are effectively poisoning yourself to prevent a sickness that your own cure might actually trigger. If the parasites don't get you, your teeth will. As we covered in Chapter 3, the sand in the bread ground teeth down to the nerves. In ancient Egypt, there were no fillings. There was no drilling and filling. If a tooth became infected, the abscess would grow until the jawbone itself began to rot. Archaeological evidence shows that even pharaohs suffered from horrific dental agony. The invisible killer here is sepsis. A simple tooth infection can spread to the bloodstream, leading to organ failure and death within days. Your only hope was a mixture of cumin, incense, and honey applied to the gum, which did exactly nothing to stop the bacteria eating through your mandible. You spend your nights in a haze of pain, clutching your jaw, praying to the god Sekhmet to stop the throbbing. For women, the most dangerous invisible killer wasn't a parasite or a tooth, it was childbirth. In a world without sterilization, the delivery room, usually a birth stool made of bricks, was a place of extreme peril. Puerperal fever, an infection of the reproductive tract, claimed a staggering percentage of mothers. The medical response? Magic spells and amulets of the god Bez. While these provided psychological comfort, they did nothing to stop the bacteria. If a baby was positioned incorrectly, there was no C-section to save the day. It was a brutal, natural selection process where the invisible killers of the microscopic world decided who lived and who died. Finally, let's talk about the flies again. They aren't just an annoyance, they are the primary vectors for trachoma, a bacterial infection that causes the eyelids to turn inward, eventually scarring the cornea and causing total blindness. In the dusty, crowded streets of an Egyptian city, eye infections were a plague. This is why everyone, from the labourers to the kings, wore kohl. The lead in the makeup was actually a desperate attempt to create a chemical barrier against the bacteria carried by the flies. If you lost your sight, you lost your ability to work. And in Egypt, if you can't work, you don't eat. Blindness was an economic death sentence before it was a physical one. The most haunting part of Egyptian medicine is the resignation. Because they didn't understand germ theory, death was seen as a calling. If you died of a fever at 22, it wasn't because the water was contaminated. It was because your car, life force were ready to move on, or a sorcerer had cursed you. As the sun sets on your day in Egypt, you realize that your survival is a miracle of statistics. You are walking around with parasites in your blood, lead in your skin, sand in your lungs, and a ticking time bomb in your molars. You've survived the shift and the Pharaoh, but the smallest invisible enemies are the ones that will eventually win the war. In our modern era, we view 35 as the prime of life, a time for career peaks, family growth, and still feeling physically capable of running a marathon. In ancient Egypt, if you've hit 35, you are an elder. You are a survivor. You are essentially playing on New Game Plus mode. The grit of the Egyptian life cycle is that the finish line is much closer than you think, and the race toward it is a brutal obstacle course. Statistics from mummified remains and skeletal records tell a harrowing story. While some elite members of society lived into their 60s or 70s, Ramesses II famously made it to his 90s. The average life expectancy for a commoner hovered between 30 and 35 years. If you survived the gauntlet of childhood, where nearly half of all children died before the age of 5, you were rewarded with a 2-decade sprint of labour before your body began to systematically fail. By your late 20s, your odometer is maxed out. We've talked about the individual stressors, the sand in the bread, the 14-hour shifts, the parasites in the water. But Chapter 7 is where we look at the cumulative effect. Archaeologists examining the skeletons of non-elite Egyptians from sites like Amarna have found a staggering rate of joint disease. By age 25, many labourers had advanced osteoarthritis in their spines, hips, and knees. Your body isn't just tired, it is structurally collapsing. The cartilage in your joints has been ground away by years of hauling limestone and bending over irrigation ditches. Every step you take toward the end of your day is a symphony of bone-on-bone friction. You aren't aging in the modern sense. You are being physically consumed by the state's demand for infrastructure, even if you manage to avoid a catastrophic injury at the quarry. The environment itself is a slow-motion assassin. Let's look at the beauty we discussed in Chapter 2. The kohl eyeliner you've been wearing since birth. It's lead-based. The green malachite eye paint. Copper-based. Over 30 years, the cumulative absorption of these heavy metals leads to chronic lead poisoning. Symptoms would have been a normal part of your late 20s. Irritability, memory loss, abdominal pain, and kidney damage. You wouldn't have called it lead poisoning. You would have called it the weight of the years. Your internal organs are being pickled in the very substances you use to protect your eyes from the sun. The grit is that the things you did to survive the day are the very things shortening your life. While the Egyptian diet of bread and beer provided enough calories to keep you moving, it was woefully lacking in variety for the lower classes. Chronic anemia was rampant. If you look at the bones of an average Egyptian, you'll often see cribra orbitalia, pitted, porous bone in the eye sockets, which is a telltale sign of severe iron deficiency and malnutrition. Your body is a house built on a shaky foundation. Because you are constantly fighting off the parasites in your gut, the invisible killers, your body can't absorb the nutrients you do eat. You are in a state of perpetual functional starvation. Your hair is thinning, your skin is leathery, and your immune system is so taxed that a simple common cold in your 30s can escalate into fatal pneumonia. because your body simply has no reserves left to fight back. The end of the road isn't just a biological reality, it's an economic one. In ancient Egypt, there is no retirement. There are no pensions. You work until you can't. And when you can't, you are a burden on a family that is already living on the razor's edge of caloric survival. If a worker broke a leg or suffered a spinal injury, the end came quickly. While there is evidence of some bones being set and healing, a permanent disability often meant a slow decline into poverty and starvation. The social fabric was strong, but the resources were thin. The grit here is the realization that your value is tied entirely to your physical output. Once the tool, your body, is broken, the machine moves on without you. As you approach your 30s, your primary concern shifts from how do I survive today to how do I survive forever. This is the ultimate irony of the Egyptian end of the road. In a culture obsessed with the afterlife, your final years are spent in a frantic race to prepare for death. You need a tomb. You need grave goods. You need to have the Book of the Dead, or at least a few key spells, ready to go. For a commoner, this might just mean saving up for a decent linen shroud and a few clay pots to be buried with in a shallow pit in the sand. But even that requires resources you don't have. The stress of knowing that your soul might be homeless because you are too poor to afford proper mummification is a psychological weight that defines your final decade. When the end finally comes, perhaps from a sudden infection, a heat stroke, or the final collapse of a parasite-ridden liver, it is rarely a peaceful passing in your sleep. It is the result of a body that has been pushed to its absolute limits. You die in the same mud brick house where you were born. The flies that woke you up every morning are there for your final breath. Your family begins the morning ritual, a loud and public display of grief that echoes through the narrow alleys. They aren't just crying for you. They are crying because the household has lost a pair of hands, a provider, and a link to the past. The desert is waiting. It has been waiting since your first day. You didn't last in ancient Egypt. You were absorbed by it. Your bones will eventually be bleached by the same sun that roasted you in life. And the sand will fill your lungs one last time. You've done it. You've survived the 110-degree sun, the lead-poisoned skin, the sand-filled bread, and the parasitic worms that turned your body into a battlefield. You are officially dead. But in ancient Egypt, death isn't a vacation. It's a promotion to a much more dangerous department. If you thought the Pharaohs' tax collectors were intimidating, wait until you meet the gods of the underworld. The grit of the Egyptian afterlife is that it wasn't a guarantee. It was an obstacle course. You don't just go to heaven, you enter the Duat, a terrifying landscape of fire-breathing serpents, lakes of boiling water, and magical gates guarded by demons with names like He Who Dances in Blood. Your goal: to reach the Hall of Truth for your final performance review. If you haven't spent your meager life savings on the right magical cheat codes, spells from the Book of the Dead, your soul is essentially walking into a minefield without a map. Before your soul can even start its journey, your physical body has to be dealt with. This is the ultimate social divide of the ancient world. If you were a member of the elite, you'd be treated to the 70-day gold standard. Organs removed, body packed in natron, and wrapped in miles of fine linen. But for you, the average labourer, your mummification is a budget DIY project. You might be injected with cedar oil to dissolve your internal organs from the inside out. Or you might simply be dried in the sun and buried in a shallow pit. The grit here is that if your body isn't preserved well enough for your car, your life force, to recognize it, you are effectively erased from existence. You are betting your eternal soul on the hope that the local undertaker didn't cut corners to save on salt. Assuming you navigate the monsters of the duat, you eventually arrive at the Hall of Two Truths. This is the final exam. You stand before Osiris, the god of the dead, and 42 other divine judges. You are required to perform the negative confession. This isn't a confession of sins. It's a list of all the bad things you didn't do. I have not stolen. I have not killed. I have not caused anyone to weep. I have not cheated the grain measure. Think about the pressure. You're standing there, naked and shivering in the spiritual cold, trying to convince 42 gods that you were a perfect person despite living in a world that forced you to scrap and steal just to get a sip of clean water. If you slip up, or if the gods sense a lie, the trial moves to the weighing of the heart. This is the most iconic and terrifying moment of your entire existence. Your heart, the seat of your intelligence and memory, is placed on one side of a golden scale. On the other side sits the feather of Ma'at, representing truth, justice, and cosmic order. If your heart is heavy with sin, or even just the grit of a hard life, the scale tips. And standing right next to the scale is Amit, the devourer of the dead. She has the head of a crocodile, the forequarters of a lion, and the hindquarters of a hippo. She isn't there for decoration. If the scale doesn't balance, Amit eats your heart. There is no hell in the Egyptian mindset, only non-existence. You don't burn, you simply cease to be. You become a nothing, a soul forgotten by time, drifting into the eternal void. But let's say you pass. Your heart is as light as a feather. Osiris smiles, and you are ushered into the Aru, or the field of reeds. This is the Egyptian paradise. But here is the grit that most people forget. The field of reeds is exactly like Egypt, just without the death and taxes. In your heaven, you still have to farm. You still have to harvest grain. The canals still need to be dug. The difference is that the crops grow 12 feet high and the work never tires you out. It's a perfected version of your day job. For a modern person, this sounds like a nightmare, an eternity of manual labor. But for an ancient Egyptian, a world where the Nile always floods perfectly and the bread has no sand in it was the highest form of bliss imaginable. As we wrap up our journey through the relentless ultraviolet violence of ancient Egypt, the reality becomes clear. You wouldn't last a day because your modern mind is built for comfort, autonomy, and safety. The Egyptians lived in a world where the environment was a god that could kill them at any moment, and their only defense was a combination of back-breaking work and desperate faith. They were a people of incredible grit. They built the impossible while suffering through the unbearable. They turned a scorching desert into the longest-running civilization in human history, all while fighting off parasites, lead poisoning, and the literal weight of the sun. You've seen the sunrise in the mud brick hut. You've tasted the sandy bread. You've felt the sting of the natron and the weight of the limestone block. You've faced the crocodile-headed monster at the end of the road. Now, it's time to leave the banks of the Nile and return to the comfort of your air-conditioned world, your soft pillows, and your water that doesn't contain worms. Cherish your toothbrush. Appreciate your lack of scent cones. And the next time you see a golden mask in a museum, remember the 14-hour shift and the fly-covered beer that paid for it. The lights are dimming. The desert wind is fading. The journey is over. Good night.